Homeless veteran bullied by immigrants. Buzz Aldrin sees the scene and does the unthinkable. William Mitchell sat against the cold brick wall of a narrow alley, his tattered coat barely shielding him from the evening chill. His face, weathered and lined with the marks of time, told a story of battles fought long ago, both on foreign soil and within himself. He had once worn a uniform with pride, serving in wars that most people now only read about in history books. He had been a soldier, a protector, a man who had dedicated his life to something greater than himself. But now he was just another forgotten soul in a city that moved too fast to care. Each day was a battle of its own. He woke up on stiff pavement, his joints aching from the night's cold, his stomach tight with hunger. He rummaged through trash, bins, hoping to find something edible, knowing that pride had no place in survival. People passed him without a second glance, some tightening their grip on their belongings, others crossing the street entirely. He had long stopped expecting kindness. Life had become a cycle of exhaustion, of existing rather than living. And yet through it all, he endured in silence, never asking for more than what little he had. A group of young men often passed through the alley where William stayed. They were immigrants, their voices loud, their laughter sharp. At first, they merely looked at him with disdain, but as the days went on, their cruelty grew bolder. They mocked him openly, their words filled with scorn. "Look at him, wasting space," one of them sneered. "What did he ever do with his life?" Another laughed. "Probably too weak to work. That's why he's here." They had no idea who he was or what he had done. They saw only a homeless man, and to them that was enough to make him worthless. William never fought back. He had seen far worse than a few insults, had endured pain that no words could match. But one evening, the taunts turned into something more. One of the young men kicked over the small bundle of belongings William kept beside him, a worn-out blanket, a few coins, a photograph he refused to part with. His stomach twisted as he watched his things scatter onto the wet pavement. Before he could reach for them, a rough shove sent him sprawling to the ground. Laughter rang in his ears. Then, without warning, the laughter stopped. A silence heavier than the city's usual noise settled over the alley. William looked up, blinking through the haze of exhaustion and pain, and saw a tall, elderly man standing at the mouth of the alley. There was something in his presence, in the way he held himself, strong, steady, unshaken. The young men, who had moments ago been so full of cruelty, now stood still, uncertain. The man's gaze swept over the scene, taking in William on the ground, his scattered belongings, and the group of young men frozen in place. His expression was calm, but his eyes held something else, something firm, something unyielding. He did not need to raise his voice. The sheer weight of his presence was enough to command attention. William, still catching his breath, could only watch as the air around them seemed to shift. Something was about to change. The tall man stepped forward, his gaze steady, his presence commanding, without a single word spoken. There was something about him, an air of authority that could not be ignored. The young men shifted uncomfortably under his stare, their laughter gone, their bravado faltering. Slowly he reached down and helped William to his feet, gripping his arm with a firm but careful strength. Despite his age, there was no fragility in him. He dusted off William's coat with methodical precision, his hands steady, his posture unshaken by time. William squinted up at him, taking in the deep lines on his face, the sharpness of his eyes. Eyes that had seen things most men never would. He recognized the face, though it took a moment for the memory to surface. It had been decades since he had seen it in newspapers, on television, in history books. The realization made his breath hitch. Buzz Aldrin, a man who had walked on the moon, a fighter pilot who had soared through enemy skies, an engineer who had helped shape the future of space exploration. And now, here he was, standing in a grimy alley, extending his hand to a man the world had forgotten. Buzz turned from William and faced the young men. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady, deliberate. "Why?" he asked simply. The young men exchanged glances. "Why what?" one of them muttered. "Why? Treat a man like this? A man who's done more for this country than you could possibly understand?" One of them scoffed, crossing his arms. "He's just a bum. He's nobody." Buzz's eyes didn't waver. "Nobody." His voice carried a quiet power, the weight of a man who had seen the world from above, who had touched the infinite and returned. "That's what you see?" Another young man shrugged. "What else are we supposed to see? He's got nothing. He's a failure." Buzz inhaled slowly, letting their words settle, not with anger, but with something deeper, something heavier. "Do you know what failure looks like?" he asked. "I've seen it, I've felt it." They stared at him, confused. The old man in front of them wasn't some nobody. He was famous, he was respected. He had been to the moon. "What failure could he possibly know?" Buzz continued, his voice even. "I was a fighter pilot in the Korean War. I flew dozens of missions. I watched men I trained with, friends, brothers, fall from the sky in flames. I carried that with me. Then I became an astronaut, trained to go where no man had ever gone before. I stood on the moon. Do you know what that feels like? To look at Earth from so far away that it fits in the palm of your hand." His gaze didn't waver. "I came back to a country that celebrated me, called me a hero. But let me tell you something." He paused, his next words landing like stones. "None of that saved me from failure." The young men frowned, puzzled. Buzz continued, his tone never rising, never losing its steady force. "After I came back, I lost myself. I struggled with depression, with drinking. I ruined my marriage. I wandered just like William. You think being homeless is failure? No. Failure is losing yourself so completely that you forget who you are. Failure is turning your back on the people who gave everything for you." Silence. Hung in the alley. The young men no longer met his eyes, their confidence cracking. Buzz turned to William. "This man fought for this country. He stood on the front lines so you could stand here today safe with a future ahead of you, and you mock him." His voice sharpened, but still he did not shout. "Do you even know what he sacrificed? What men like him have carried so that you don't have to?" One of the young men shifted uncomfortably. We didn't know." Buzz's gaze didn't soften. "Then you should have asked." William cleared his throat, his voice hoarse but steady. "I was in the Gulf War. I saw things you don't ever want to see. I came back, tried to rebuild. It didn't work. I lost people, lost everything I had. And yeah, I ended up here." He gestured around him. "But I didn't give up. I just got left behind." The weight of his words settled over them, thick and undeniable. The young men shifted, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. Buzz exhaled, watching them, letting them sit with what they had just heard. Then, finally, he spoke again. "If you truly want to be Americans, if you want to earn the right to stand here, then start by understanding what this country was built on. It wasn't built on tearing men down. It was built on honor, on respect, on standing together." He took a step closer. "You think a man is weak because he has nothing? No. Weakness is looking at a man's suffering and thinking it makes you stronger." The words hit harder than any lecture, any punishment. The young men who had walked into that alley with smugness, with arrogance, now stood silent, their heads lowered. Buzz straightened, his expression unwavering. "Now the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The challenge hung in the air, and for the first time that night, the young men had no easy answer. Buzz held their gaze, his expression unwavering, his presence alone commanding something deeper than fear. Respect. The silence stretched, thick and unrelenting, as the young men stood motionless, absorbing the weight of his words. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto theirs. "You think being broke is failure?" he said, his voice steady, each word like a stone dropping into still water. "No, failure is forgetting what makes a man. Failure is losing yourself so completely that you don't recognize what you stood for, what you fought for, what you were willing to give up for something greater than yourself." They didn't speak, didn't try to argue. Something in them had already begun to shift, though they didn't yet know it. Buzz could see it, the way their shoulders tensed, the way their eyes flickered with something close to shame. He knew. That feeling, he had lived it. "I spent my life preparing for the impossible," he continued, his voice measured but heavy with something more than just memory. "I trained, I fought, I sacrificed, and I walked on the moon. People called me a hero. They put my name in history books. But do you know what happened when I came back?" He let the question hang for a moment, the wind carrying only the distant hum of the city. "I lost myself. I fell into a darkness I never saw coming. I drank. I pushed away the people who loved me. I destroyed my marriage, my family, my own. Damn self-respect." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "And the worst part, no one saw it, no one cared. They all thought, he's Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, the fighter pilot. He's fine." But I wasn't. I was drowning. The young men shifted uncomfortably, some looking down, others watching him with something between unease and curiosity. "You think this man is weak because he's on the street?" Buzz gestured toward William, who stood silent beside him, his expression unreadable. "You have no idea what strength looks like." He turned to William, his voice softening just a fraction. "Tell them." William hesitated. He had spent years swallowing his pain, keeping his past buried beneath exhaustion and silence. But something about the way Buzz stood beside him, the way this man, who had once looked down at the entire world, was willing to stand here, in this alley, with him, made the words come easier than he expected. "I was 19 when I enlisted," he began, his voice rough, as if the words had to claw their way out. "I wanted to fight for something. I believed in something. I went to war, and I watched men, good men, men who were barely more than boys, die right in front of me. I held them as they bled out, told them lies about how they were going to be okay when I knew damn well they wouldn't make it." His hands curled into fists. "I saved people too, pulled them out of burning vehicles, ran through gunfire just to get them out. But none of that mattered when I came home. The war didn't end for me. It was in my head. It followed me everywhere." He swallowed, his throat tight. "I lost everything. My job, my home, my family. Not because I didn't fight, not because I didn't try, but because war doesn't let you go." The young men stood frozen, their faces unreadable, but William could see it now. The understanding creeping in, the realization that they had never stopped to consider what a man like him might have gone through. He exhaled shakily, as if speaking the words had loosened something heavy inside him. Buzz nodded, as if William had just confirmed something he had long understood. He turned back to the young men, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "This country isn't just a place. It's an idea built by men who were willing to give up everything for it. And men like William, they didn't do it for themselves. They did it for you, for your families, for the future." His gaze was sharp, unrelenting. "You think being American is just about living here? No. It's about understanding what this country is, what it stands for. It's about respecting the ones who bled for it, even when no one remembers their names." One of the young men shifted, his arms dropping from the defensive stance he had held earlier. Another rubbed the back of his neck, glancing down at William's scattered belongings on the ground. The arrogance that had been in their eyes when they first walked into that alley was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, something heavier. "Buzz." Let the silence settle before he spoke again, his voice even. "Now you have a choice. You can walk away, Pretend this conversation never happened. Keep going through life thinking you're better than the men who made it possible for you to stand here. Or... He let the word hang, making sure they were listening. You can. Start acting like the men you claim to be. They didn't ask what he meant. They already knew. One of them bent down first, picking up William's blanket, shaking off the dirt before holding it out to him. Another grabbed the few scattered coins, pressing them back into William's palm. The others followed, no longer mocking, no longer smirking. It wasn't just about cleaning up his things. It was about something more. A quiet apology, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had been wrong. Buzz watched, his face unreadable, but William could see it. The slight nod, the almost imperceptible satisfaction in his eyes. He had spent his life fighting battles most men couldn't even fathom, but this was the kind of victory that mattered. Help him, Buzz said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. Find him a place to stay, a job, not because he asked for it, but because you owe it. Because respect isn't about words, it's about what you do. The young men nodded, not out of obligation, but because they knew now that he was right. William, for the first time in years, let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been left behind for good. The next morning, William awoke to something unfamiliar. People waiting for him, not to mock him, but to help. The same young men who had once jeered at him now stood at the edge of the alley, shifting awkwardly, as if unsure of how to begin. One of them, the one who had thrown his belongings into the street, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We found a shelter," he said, his voice unsteady but sincere. "They've got a bed for you, meals too." William stared at them, searching their faces for any sign of mockery, but found none. They weren't just saying this because they had been told to. They meant it. He hesitated, not out of pride, but because trusting was hard when you'd spent years being ignored. But then he saw Buzz standing a few feet behind them, watching with quiet expectation. The old astronaut had done more than give them a lesson. He had given them responsibility, and they had accepted it. One of the other young men stepped forward, holding out a bag. "We got you some clothes, too. Just some basics, but, figured you might need 'em." William took the bag slowly, feeling the weight of their actions more than the fabric inside. It wasn't just about the clothes or the shelter. It was about something deeper, something he had nearly forgotten, the feeling of being seen, of being worth something. He gave them a small nod. "Thanks." The shelter was warm, the bed clean, and for the first time in years, William slept without the cold biting at his bones. The next day, the young men returned, this time with something more unexpected, a job opportunity. "My uncle works security at a warehouse," one of them explained. "We told him about you. He said they're looking for someone dependable, someone who knows how to handle tough situations." He scratched his head. "Figured you'd be perfect." William didn't respond right away. A job. The idea of it felt foreign, almost impossible. He had once been a soldier, a protector, but life had stripped him of that identity piece by piece. Could he step into that role again? He glanced at Buzz, who stood nearby, watching him the way a commander watches a soldier about to take the first step onto the battlefield. "Up to you," Buzz said simply. "But I've seen tougher men than you break. And I've seen them stand back up again. You decide which one you are." The decision wasn't easy. Doubt still lingered, clawing at the edges of his mind, whispering that it was too late for him, that the world had already moved on. But then he remembered the way Buzz had stood beside him, the way these young men had worked to make things right. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The night before his interview, Buzz met him outside the shelter, a coffee in each hand. He handed one to William, then took a seat on the bench beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them easy, unforced. "You know," Buzz finally said, staring ahead, "people think the hardest part of going to the moon was getting there. They're wrong." William glanced at him. "Yeah? Buzz nodded. The hardest part was coming back, standing on the moon. That's easy, it's quiet, empty. But coming back to Earth? Back to a world that expects you to just be the same. Men you were before you left. That's the real challenge. He took a sip of his coffee. I lost myself when I came back. Spent years trying to find my footing again. Thought I never would. He turned to William. But you know what I learned? William shook his head. Buzz smiled slightly. The hardest battles aren't fought. Out there, he gestured vaguely to the sky. They're fought in here. He tapped his temple. And the only way to win is to keep moving forward, no matter how many times you fall. William let the words sink in. He had fallen more times than he could count, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to get back up. The morning of the interview, William stood outside the warehouse, dressed in the clothes the young men had given him. His hands clenched at his sides, nerves tightening in his chest. It had been so long since he had been in a position like this, since someone had expected something of him. He took a deep breath. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked. Inside, from a distance, Buzz watched, his sharp eyes following William until he disappeared through the doors. He didn't need to say anything. He had seen men take their first steps in places no one had ever gone before, and he recognized this moment for what it was. William wasn't just walking into a job interview. He was stepping into the next chapter of his life. The young men stood beside Buzz, watching as well. They had apologized the night before, their words genuine, their regret undeniable, but it was their actions now that spoke louder. They had learned the lesson Buzz had wanted them to understand, not just about respect, but about responsibility, about what it truly meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. One of them exhaled and turned to Buzz. "Think he'll get the job?" Buzz gave a small, knowing smile. "I think," he said, "he's already won."